before the fame, before the spotlight, and long before the world knew her as the greatest sharpshooter of her time, Annie Oakley was simply Phoebe and Mosey, a little girl growing up on the edge of rural America. Her story doesn't begin in a bustling city or under a circus tent. It begins on a modest farm near the small village of Woodland in Darke County, Ohio, far away from the rugged landscapes of the American frontier that would one day become tied to her name. She was born on August 13, 1860, the sixth child of Jacob and Susan Mosey, both Quakers. Life in rural Ohio during the mid-19th century was neither glamorous nor easy. Families lived close to the land, relying on the rhythm of the seasons, the strength of their hands, and the resilience of their spirit. In this quiet corner of America, young Phoebe, whom everyone called Annie, learned the values of hard work and self-reliance that would shape the rest of her life. From the very start, Annie's world was defined by humble means and family bonds. Her father, Jacob, was 61 years old when she was born, much older than most fathers of the time. He was a hard-working man who took great pride in providing for his growing family. Annie's mother, Susan, managed their bustling household and cared for their many children. Life was simple, centered around chores, farming, and community gatherings. But it was also fragile. A single bad harvest, a harsh winter, or an unexpected illness could push families to the brink. Annie's early years were filled with the innocence of rural childhood, running through fields, climbing trees with her siblings, and helping around the farm. She preferred the outdoors to needlework or dolls, a trait that set her apart even as a little girl. Her father often ventured into the woods to trap and hunt, providing meat for the family during lean months. Young Annie watched him with quiet fascination, not knowing that those moments of observation were planting the seeds of her extraordinary future. But Annie's carefree days were short-lived. When she was just 6 years old, tragedy struck. Her father fell gravely ill during one brutal winter and never recovered. His death left the family without its primary provider. For a household with 9 children, the loss was devastating. To make matters worse, within a year, Annie's older sister Mary Jane died of tuberculosis. 2 deaths in such a short span brought emotional grief and financial strain. Susan Mosey, suddenly widowed and overwhelmed, was forced to make difficult choices to keep her remaining children alive. In order to pay for Mary Jane's funeral, the family had to sell their beloved cow, Pink, one of their most valuable possessions. Soon after, they sold the family farm as well. They moved into a rented home, smaller and less secure, struggling to make ends meet. Annie, still a child, began contributing in any way she could, caring for younger siblings, doing chores, and helping her mother manage daily survival. Her schooling became irregular. Survival, not education, was the priority. Yet within this hardship lay the beginnings of Annie's gift. Her father had been a skill hunter, and Annie had watched him closely. She knew where he set his snares, how he moved silently through the woods, and how carefully he handled his rifle. One day, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of curiosity, she decided to try it herself. She picked up the family rifle, loaded it, and fired at a target. The recoil knocked to the ground, but she didn't give up. She adjusted, tried again, and kept practicing. Before long, she was hunting small game, rabbits, squirrels, birds, with a precision that surprised everyone. What began as a desperate attempt to put food on the table turned into the first demonstration of her natural sharpshooting talent. When it felt right, I just pulled the trigger, she would later say, describing her early instinct with firearms. This skill wasn't a hobby. It became a lifeline for her family. Despite her efforts, Annie's mother Susan still couldn't support all her children. Faced with heart-wrenching decisions, she sent some of the younger ones to live with neighbors, while 9-year-old Annie was sent to the county infirmary in Greenville, Ohio, also known as the Poor Farm. This institution housed not only orphans and destitute families, but also the mentally ill, a harsh environment for any child. Yet Annie's ordeal was only beginning. One day, a well-dressed farmer and his wife arrived at the infirmary. They appeared kind and promised to take in a young girl to help with household chores. They offered a modest wage and promised to send her to school. It sounded like an opportunity for stability and education. Annie was chosen and left with them, believing she was heading toward a better life. Instead, she entered what she would later describe as the darkest chapter of her childhood. She never revealed their real names, only calling them the Wolves. Behind closed doors, their kindness vanished. They treated Annie not as a child, but as a servant. Her days began before dawn and ended long after sunset. At just 10 years old, her daily schedule included making breakfast, milking cows, feeding pigs, washing dishes, carrying water, tending the garden, rocking the baby and preparing dinner. Mistakes were met not with correction, but with cruelty. The she-wolf punished her harshly for falling asleep during chores by locking her outside in the freezing winter snow, barefoot, leaving her to nearly freeze before the farmer returned home and let her in. Annie endured physical beatings, emotional abuse, and relentless labor. She bore scars and welts on her back from their cruelty, marks that would stay with her for life. This was no idyllic farm life. This was survival through suffering. Yet even in these moments of pain, Annie's resilience hardened. She didn't let this break her spirit. She endured for nearly 2 years, waiting for the right moment. And finally, she escaped, making her way back to the Greenville Infirmary. By then, it was run by Samuel and Nancy Eddington, kind people who welcomed her into their home and treated her like family. They enrolled her in school alongside their own children. For the first time in years, Annie smiled again. Her classmates nicknamed her Topsy because she showed all her teeth when she grinned. She didn't mind. After everything she had endured, a simple nickname felt like warmth. At 15, Annie returned to her mother's household. Her older sisters had married, and her mother had remarried and moved to the village of North Star, Ohio. Though life was still hard, Annie had developed not only her marksmanship, but also her strength, independence, and maturity far beyond her years. Her humble beginnings, the farm life, the early tragedies, the cruel years of the wolves, were the forge in which her character was shaped. She was no longer just a farm girl. She was a survivor, a skill provider, and unknowingly on the path to becoming a legend. When Annie Oakley returned home as a teenager, she carried more than just the emotional weight of her difficult childhood. She brought with her an unshakable resilience, sharp instincts, and a natural eye of a hunter. What began as a survival skill in the woods of Ohio would soon blossom into one of the most extraordinary shooting talents the world had ever seen. Life in rural Dark County remained challenging. The Civil War had ended, but the scars it left on the country ran deep. Opportunities for poor farming families were scarce, and every extra penny counted. For Annie's family, money was always tight, and providing food was still a daily struggle. While many young girls her age were learning sewing, music, or homemaking, Annie's classroom was a dense Ohio woodland, and her teacher was necessity itself. From the moment she first shouldered her father's old rifle as a little girl, Annie had shown a natural gift for marksmanship. Now, as a teenager, that gift became almost uncanny. She could strike a squirrel in the head at 30 yards, something even experienced hunters often struggled to do. She understood instinctively that hitting an animal anywhere else would damage the meat and lower its selling value. Her shots were clean, precise, and efficient. She wasn't just a good shot. She was a provider, feeding her family and contributing to their survival. Each morning, Annie would venture into the woods at dawn, moving silently along familiar paths. She knew where rabbits darted through underbrush, where quail settled at sunrise, and how to anticipate a squirrel's jump from branch to branch. She walked with the poise of someone much older, her rifle steady, her breath controlled. She didn't waste bullets. She couldn't afford to. Every shot had to count. Soon, word began to spread through nearby towns and markets about the young girl with the perfect aim. She would bring her game to the local storekeeper in Greenville, who would then sell it to hotels and restaurants in Cincinnati. Her accuracy meant her game was of the highest quality. No shattered meat, no wasted kills. She earned enough money to pay off her mother's mortgage. This was no small feat for a teenager in the late 19th century. It wasn't just about skill anymore. It was about economic power. It was during these years that Annie began to sharpen her techniques beyond mere hunting. She learned how to adjust for wind, compensate for distance, and fire rapidly with precision. She practiced shooting while on the move, hitting airborne targets, and even firing from unusual angles. Her abilities were self-taught, molded by necessity and refined by endless repetition. She had no instructor, no formal training, just raw talent and a relentless work ethic. By the time Annie was 15, she had developed a local reputation. Farmers, hunters, and townsfolk admired her. They marveled at the idea that a young woman could outshoot seasoned men. Her fame spread quietly but steadily, carried on whispers, local newspapers, and the astonished words of those who had seen her shoot. Then came the moment that would change the trajectory of her life forever. In 1875, a traveling marksman named Frankie Butler arrived in Cincinnati with a shooting act. Butler, a confident and skilled Irish-born sharpshooter, challenged local marksmen to a shooting contest as part of his traveling show. He offered a $100 bet to anyone who could beat him, an enormous sum at the time. One local hotelier, familiar with Annie's ability, recommended her as a challenger. At first, Frank thought it was a joke. A teenage girl competing against a seasoned professional? The idea seemed almost laughable to him. But Annie accepted the challenge without hesitation. She didn't boast. She didn't swagger. She simply showed up with her trusted rifle. The contest was held at the Beck and Howard shooting range in Cincinnati. Spectators gathered, curious to see the outcome. Frank Butler began, hitting 24 clay pigeons out of 25, an impressive score that drew applause. Then it was Annie's turn. She stepped up calmly, leveled her gun, and began shooting. One after another, the clay targets shattered in the air. 25 out of 25, a perfect score. She had beaten Frank Butler decisively. The crowd erupted in cheers. Butler, both impressed and humbled, reportedly tipped his hat to the young woman who had bested him. He didn't respond with anger or humiliation. He responded with admiration. This contest wasn't just a personal victory for Annie. It was a moment the wider world caught its first glimpse of her extraordinary skill. Frank Butler didn't forget Annie after that day. He began visiting her, and a mutual respect grew between them, eventually leading to a lifelong partnership both on and off the stage. But before she became his partner, Annie continued to hone her craft, entering local shooting matches, performing in formal exhibitions, and earning a reputation that spread beyond Ohio's borders. What set Annie apart wasn't just her accuracy, it was her composure. Onlookers noted how serene she seemed while shooting. She didn't fidget or show nerves. Her movements were smooth, controlled, almost elegant. She had the bearing of a professional long before she ever joined a professional show. In an era when women were expected to remain in domestic spaces, Annie stood on shooting ranges, competing with men and winning. Annie's talent wasn't a trick act. She wasn't relying on flashy gimmicks or stage theatrics. Her skill was real, tested, and undeniable. She could split a playing card on its edge, snuff out a candle with a bullet, or shoot the ash off a cigarette at astonishing distances. These feats would later become famous parts of her show, but even in her teenage years, she was already laying the foundation for such extraordinary marksmanship. She also began to customize her equipment. She favored small-caliber rifles for precision work and practiced with a variety of firearms to increase her adaptability. She understood her weapons intimately, their weight, their balance, their quirks. She cleaned and maintained them herself, treating them not just as tools, but as extensions of her own hands. Despite her rising fame, Annie remained humble and soft-spoken. She didn't brag about her abilities. Her goal was not to prove that she was better than men. It was simply to excel at something she loved and depended on. She carried herself with quiet confidence, letting her results speak louder than her words. In this way, she began to shape not only her personal image, but also the way female sharpshooters would be perceived for generations. This period of Annie Oakley's life represents more than just a discovery of a skill. It was a refinement of a gift. What had started as a means of survival for a fatherless farm girl now stood poised to catapult her into the world of professional entertainment and international fame. Her rifle had become both her shield and her stage, and the world was beginning to notice. By the late 1870s, Annie Oakley was no longer just a talented teenage shooter in Ohio. She was becoming a local legend. Her sharp eye and steady hands had already humbled experienced marksmen, and her name was circulating in shooting circles beyond her hometown. But the world had not yet truly seen her. That moment would come when she crossed paths with one of the most famous showmen in American history, William Frederick Buffalo Bill Cody. Before that meeting, Annie's life took a significant personal turn. Frank E. Butler, the professional sharpshooter she had defeated in the Cincinnati contest, had been both surprised and impressed by her skill. What began as rivalry soon turned into respect, and then love. Annie and Frank married in 1876. Unlike many men of his era, Frank recognized Annie's extraordinary talent and was willing to step back from the spotlight to let her shine. They became partners not only in life, but in performance. Together, Annie and Frank began touring small shooting exhibitions across the Midwest and the East Coast. Annie performed under the stage name Annie Oakley, inspired by a neighborhood in Cincinnati called Oakley, where she had lived for a time. She crafted a public image that was both wholesome and extraordinary. While she dressed modestly and carried herself with ladylike grace, her abilities with firearm were breathtaking. She didn't fit the mold of a rough-and-tumble frontier woman. She was something entirely new, a sharpshooter who combined elegance with dead-eye precision. The 1880s were a period of rapid change in America. The frontier was closing, Railroads were weaving across the continent, and Wild West shows were emerging as one of the most popular forms of entertainment. These shows were part theater, part circus, part living history. They featured cowboys, Native Americans, sharpshooters, trick riders, and reenactments of famous frontier battles. They presented a romanticized version of the Old West, thrilling audiences in cities across America and eventually around the world. The most famous of all these shows was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, founded by the legendary buffalo hunter, scout, and showman William Buffalo Bill Cody in 1883. His production was not a simple carnival act. It was a massive, well-organized spectacle that traveled with hundreds of performers, horses, wagons, and elaborate sets. It was designed to awe audiences with its size and to celebrate American frontier culture on a grand scale. Frank and Annie's Path to Buffalo Bill's show came in 1885. At the time, Buffalo Bill was searching for new talent to keep his show fresh and exciting. Word had reached him about a petite woman who could outshoot almost anyone. Frank and Annie arranged to give a demonstration in New Orleans, where the Wild West troupe was performing. The story goes that when Annie began shooting, she impressed not only the scouts and marksmen, but Buffalo Bill himself. Her calm demeanor, flawless accuracy, and ability to engage the audience made her stand out instantly. That same year, Annie Oakley officially joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West, marking the beginning of a partnership that would transform her into an international superstar. She was about 25 years old. Frank, demonstrating remarkable humility and business sense, stepped aside from the center stage to become her manager and assistant, ensuring that her talent would take the spotlight. From the moment she debuted with the Wild West show, Annie became a sensation. She performed feats that seemed impossible to the average spectator, splitting playing cards edge-on, shooting cigarettes from her husband's lips, hitting dimes tossed into the air, and even shooting backward over her shoulder using a mirror to aim. Her performances weren't just technically brilliant. They were dramatic and elegant, captivating audiences of all ages. Buffalo Bill was a master of branding and showmanship, and he recognized Annie's unique appeal. In an era when women were expected to be confined to domestic roles, Annie Oakley stood on stage with a rifle, commanding attention with quiet confidence. She wore modest but stylish dresses, often with fringe or decorative stitching, and she maintained her ladylike manners on and off stage. This combination of femininity and fierce skill made her an icon. She wasn't threatening to audiences. She was inspiring. Her presence also brought something valuable to the show: respectability. While Wild West shows were often seen as rowdy entertainments, Annie's refined image attracted families, women, and high society audiences who might otherwise have dismissed the performances. She broadened the show's appeal and became one of its most bankable stars. The Wild West show was unlike anything the world had seen. It traveled by train, carrying an entire mobile frontier town. Performances included reenactments of famous battles, stagecoach attacks, cowboy roping demonstrations, Native American dances, and spectacular trick riding. But no act generated more anticipation than Annie Oakley's. Her name began appearing prominently on posters and in newspapers. Reporters marveled at the little sure shot, a nickname given to her by none other than Sitting Bull, the famous Lakota leader. Sitting Bull joined the Wild West show for a time after the events of the Battle of Little Bighorn. He met Annie backstage and was captivated by her talent, grace, and humility. He adopted her as his daughter, giving her the name Watanya Cecilia, meaning Little Sure Shot. The nickname stuck, and Annie embraced it proudly. Their unlikely friendship became one of the most memorable aspects of her early career with Buffalo Bill. As part of the troupe, Annie traveled across the United States and Europe, performing before massive crowds. Her reputation grew with each tour. She wasn't just another act. She was a star whose precision shooting left audiences stunned. One contemporary report noted that she could hit a dime toss in the air at 30 paces 9 times out of 10, a feat that seemed almost supernatural at the time. Her rise to fame coincided with the emergence of mass media. Newspapers, posters, and later, early photography helped spread her image far and wide. Her signature look, the small, confident woman in a fringe dress, holding a rifle with perfect poise, became instantly recognizable. She embodied both the romantic vision of the frontier and the changing role of women in society. She showed that women could excel in fields dominated by men without sacrificing their dignity or grace. Traveling with Buffalo Bill's Wild West wasn't easy. Performers lived out of train cars, performed in all-weather conditions, and maintained grueling schedules. But Annie thrived under the spotlight. She practiced constantly to maintain her edge, refining her techniques, and inventing new tricks to keep her act fresh. Her work ethic matched her talent, and that combination made her unstoppable. Her rise through Buffalo Bill's Wild West was more than just personal success. It was a cultural phenomenon. At a time when America was still defining its identity, Annie Oakley became one of its most celebrated figures. She represented skill, perseverance, and the mythic spirit of the West, packaged in the unassuming frame of a 5-foot-tall woman with an iron will and unmatched aim. By the mid-1880s, Annie Oakley had already become a star across the United States through her dazzling performances with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. But her fame was about to transcend the borders of America. What lay ahead would not only elevate her reputation as the greatest sharpshooter of her age, but also transform her into a global celebrity, admired by common citizens and crowned heads alike. Annie was about to step onto the international stage, where her aim and grace would captivate audiences from London to Paris and beyond. In 1887, Buffalo Bill Cody received an invitation that would change the course of his entire show, to perform at the American Exhibition in London, held in conjunction with Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, a celebration marking the monarch's 50th year on the throne. This was no small engagement. Britain was the heart of a global empire, and London was a cultural and political center of the world. To perform there meant stepping into the international spotlight, with all eyes watching. Buffalo Bill saw this as a perfect opportunity to showcase America's frontier spirit to Europe. The entire troupe, including hundreds of performers, Native American warriors, horses, stagecoaches, wagons, and marksmen, was loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic. It was a massive logistical feat, unprecedented in scale. Among the performers was Annie Oakley, who, despite her humble beginnings, was about to perform before royalty. London was abuzz with anticipation. Newspapers described the arrival of Buffalo Bill's Wild West as if a piece of the American frontier had been transplanted into Victorian Britain. Crowds gathered outside the exhibition grounds to catch glimpses of cowboys in wide-brimmed hats and Lakota warriors in full regalia. British society, with its rigid class structure, was both fascinated and amused by these rugged, larger-than-life figures. On May 11, 1887, the show opened before a distinguished audience that included Queen Victoria herself. The aging monarch, rarely seen at public events in her later years, made a special appearance to witness the Wild West spectacle. The performers were nervous. This was the most prestigious audience they had ever faced. For Annie Oakley, who had once been a poor farm girl in Ohio, the moment was almost surreal. When it came time for her act, Annie stepped onto Grand Arena with her usual quiet confidence. She wore her trademark fringe costume, her hair neatly tied, her demeanor calm. The crowd fell silent as she raised her rifle. In a series of breathtaking displays, she shattered glass balls midair, hit coins tossed high above the ground, and performed her signature trick of splitting a playing card on its edge. Her movements were smooth and unhurried, as if she were practicing alone in the woods, not performing before the Queen of England. Queen Victoria was delighted. She reportedly smiled broadly and nodded in approval at Annie's performance, a rare public show of enthusiasm from the reserved monarch. The audience erupted in cheers, and Annie was showered with admiration. That day, she didn't just entertain royalty, she earned their respect. The British press praised her as the peerless shot and a wonder of the age, writing detailed accounts of her precision and poise. The success of the London exhibition was overwhelming. Night after night, the Wild West show performed before massive crowds, including dukes, duchesses, politicians, and ordinary Londoners. Annie became a sensation. Her name appeared in newspapers across Britain, and caricatures of her were featured in magazines. She was celebrated not only for her unmatched shooting ability, but also for her graceful demeanor, which defied European stereotypes of the rough American frontier. During her time in Britain, Annie was invited to participate in private shooting exhibitions for members of the royal family and European aristocracy. These were intimate events held on palace grounds or at country estates, where she would demonstrate her skills up close. Members of the royal court tossed glass balls into the air for her to hit. Others challenged her with increasingly difficult shots. She never missed. One of the most famous stories from her London tour involves Kaiser Wilhelm II, the future Emperor of Germany. During a performance, Annie was asked to shoot the ashes off a cigarette held in the Kaiser's mouth. It was a stunt she had performed many times before with her husband Frank. But doing so before a European prince was something else entirely. With steady hands and unflinching confidence, Annie aimed and fired. The cigarette ash exploded, leaving the Kaiser unharmed but wide-eyed with astonishment. The crowd erupted in applause, and the story quickly spread through Europe's press. In later years, Annie joked about this moment, saying she regretted not missing when Kaiser Wilhelm became a key figure leading Germany into World War I. It was a playful quip that showed her wit, but at the time, the event cemented her reputation as fearlessly accurate. Following the triumph in Britain, Buffalo Bill's Wild West embarked on an extensive European tour. The troupe traveled to France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Austria, and other countries, bringing the mythic American frontier to audiences who had only read about it in novels and newspapers. Everywhere they went, Annie Oakley was the star attraction. In Paris, fashionable women admired her costumes and manners. In Berlin, military officers marveled at her shooting precision. In Rome, nobles compared her to the legendary warriors of old. What made Annie's performances so impactful was not just her technical skill, but the way she bridged cultural divides. Europeans expected rough cowboys and fierce warriors. Instead, they saw a petite, refined woman who could outshoot any man alive. She represented both the frontier spirit and the evolving role of women. At the turn of the century, her presence challenged assumptions and left lasting impressions. Annie also took advantage of her growing fame to build friendships with influential figures across Europe. She mingled with aristocrats, dined with military officers, and was often presented with gifts, medals, and honors. Yet, despite the adoration, she remained grounded. She wrote letters home, kept a modest demeanor, and stayed focused on her craft. She never allowed fame to overshadow the values of discipline and humility she had learned in her youth. By the time the European tour ended, Annie Oakley had achieved something few performers of her time could dream of. She was not just famous in America, but celebrated on the world stage. She had performed for queens, princes, and commoners alike, and everywhere she went, she left audiences astonished. She became a global ambassador for American skill and showmanship, helping to shape how the world viewed the young, rising nation across the Atlantic. Her international tours weren't just about entertainment. They were about cultural exchange, about proving that extraordinary talent could rise from the humblest beginnings and captivate the most powerful people on earth. Through her journeys, Annie Oakley's legend spread across continents, carried by newspapers, word of mouth, and the awe of those who witnessed her perfect aim. The year was 1881. The dusty fairgrounds of Cincinnati were alive with chatter, horse hooves, and the smell of gunpowder drifting to the late afternoon air. Crowds gathered around makeshift shooting ranges, drawn by the sound of rifles cracking to the sky like thunder. Among the spectators was a young woman, small in stature, but steady as a rock. Her name, Annie Oakley. Until this point, Annie's extraordinary skill had been known mostly in her local Ohio community. She had hunted game to feed her family, sold birds to hotels and restaurants, and outshot nearly every man she met. But on this day, everything was about to change. A traveling marksman, the famous Irish-born sharpshooter Frank E. Butler, had issued a public challenge. Anyone who could beat him in a shooting match would win $100. It was a spectacle meant to draw crowds and reinforce his status as one of the greatest shooters in America. He didn't expect a challenger to be a teenage girl, wearing a simple dress and a quiet smile. Annie stepped onto the range, rifle in hand. The crowd laughed, some doubting, some curious. Butler, amused, treated it like a friendly novelty. The rules were simple. 25 clay targets would be thrown, one after another. Whoever hit the most would be declared the winner. Butler went first, 24 out of 25, a near-perfect score. The crowd cheered. Then it was Annie's turn. Calmly, she positioned her feet, lifted her rifle, and with the precision of years spent hunting in silence, she fired. One after another, the clay pigeons shattered midair. 25 shots, 25 hits. The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted in cheers. Butler had been bested, not by a seasoned marksman, but by a young woman whose poise and accuracy stunned everyone watching. This moment marked a turning point in Annie's life. Her victory wasn't just about prize money. It was about stepping onto the national stage. News of the girl sharpshooter spread quickly, carried by word of mouth in local papers. She had proven she could compete with and even defeat the best in the business. Interestingly, this competition also led to an unexpected twist in her personal life. Frank Butler, rather than feeling humiliated, was deeply impressed by Annie's talent and character. Over time, the two developed a close bond. Their mutual respect grew into love, and eventually, they married. Frank would later become Annie's manager and biggest supporter, choosing to step back from the spotlight to help elevate her career. A remarkable move for the time. As Annie's fame grew, she began performing in local exhibitions and fairs, dazzling audiences with her pinpoint accuracy. She could shoot dimes tossed into the air, hit targets while riding a bicycle, or even fire backward using a mirror to aim. Crowds weren't just impressed, they were captivated. In an era when women were expected to remain in the background, Annie Oakley stood front and center with a rifle in hand, challenging societal norms with every shot. But it was in 1885 that her life truly changed. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, one of the most famous traveling entertainment spectacles in the world, was looking for fresh talent. The show combined sharpshooting, horseback stunts, reenactments of frontier battles, and displays of cowboy skill, thrilling audiences across America and Europe. Annie auditioned and quickly secured a spot. Her natural grace, combined with her deadly accuracy, made her a star almost overnight. On stage, Annie crafted a persona that blended strength with elegance. She wore beautifully tailored costumes, often with fringes and embroidery, projecting both femininity and authority. Audiences adored her. She could split playing cards in half edgewise, hit targets while standing on horseback, or shoot a cigarette out her husband's lips without hesitation. Each performance was part skill, part showmanship, and Annie understood that better than anyone. Her popularity grew so rapidly that she soon became one of the headliners of Buffalo Bill's show. She performed before kings and queens, most famously before Queen Victoria in 1887 during the troupe's European tour. In London, the show drew massive crowds, and Annie's sharpshooting was a highlight. She impressed not only the public, but also military officers and nobility who came to see the legendary Little Sure Shot, a nickname given to her by Lakota leader Sitting Bull, who admired her courage and precision. He even adopted her as his daughter in a symbolic ceremony, a testament to the respect she commanded. Annie's performances weren't just entertainment. They were cultural statements. In a world where women's roles were tightly controlled, she demonstrated that skill, intelligence, and grace could break boundaries. She was a walking contradiction to stereotypes, a woman who could outshoot any man, yet remain poised, polite, and confident. Her fame also helped change perceptions of sharpshooting itself, transforming it from a purely masculine pursuit into a respected art form that both genders could excel in. As the Wild West show traveled across continents, Annie's reputation reached new heights. Newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin wrote glowing reviews. Her image appeared on posters and promotional materials, often front and center. Audiences waited in long lines just to catch a glimpse of her performances. Unlike many performers of the time who faded into obscurity between tours, Annie maintained her discipline. She practiced daily, ensuring her skills remained razor-sharp no matter where she was. Behind the scenes, Frank Butler continued to support her tirelessly. He managed logistics, bookings, and promotions, allowing Annie to focus on what she did best, shooting. Their partnership was built on mutual trust and respect, a rarity in show business then. Annie's humility also endeared her to colleagues and fans alike. She was known to help other performers, mentor younger sharpshooters, and treat everyone, from stagehands to star acts, with kindness. By the end of the 1880s, Annie Oakley was no longer just a talented girl from Ohio. She was an international sensation, a symbol of precision, courage, and elegance. Her rise to fame was not a matter of chance. It was built on years of hardship, relentless practice, and an unshakable sense of purpose. She had turned her childhood skills, born out of necessity, into a legendary career that would inspire generations to come. And this was only the beginning. The world had seen Annie Oakley perform her, the marksman, the crowd favorite. But ahead lay new challenges, opportunities, and moments that would test her reputation and cement her place in history as one of the greatest sharpshooters the world had ever seen. As Annie Oakley's fame reached its peak, she could have easily chosen to focus only on the glamorous show business, dazzling audiences, signing contracts, and enjoying the privileges of celebrity. But Annie was never content with being just a performer. Beneath the sharp aim and the polished stage presence was a woman who deeply believed in using her influence to uplift others, especially women and children who, like her younger self, faced limited opportunities and harsh realities. In the late 19th century, American society was still rigid in its expectations of women. Most were confined to domestic roles, with few avenues to pursue careers, education, or personal independence. Sharpshooting, marksmanship, or any form of competitive sport was largely considered a man's domain. Annie Oakley, through her unparalleled skill, had already broken that mold. But she wanted to do more than simply set an example. She wanted to actively empower other women. Throughout her touring years with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and during her later independent exhibitions, Annie devoted significant time to teaching women how to shoot. She held training sessions, workshops, and personal demonstrations across the United States and Europe. Reports estimate that she trained over 15,000 women in marksmanship over her lifetime. This was not a symbolic gesture. Annie personally instructed women from various walks of life, from farmers' daughters to society ladies, teaching them everything from basic firearm safety to advanced techniques. Her reasons were practical as well as ideological. She firmly believed that women should know how to defend themselves, especially in isolated rural areas or on the American frontier, where law enforcement was often distant and unreliable. At a time when suffrage movements were gaining momentum and women were beginning to question their restricted roles, Annie offered them not just a skill, but a form of confidence and independence. She once said, "I would like to see every woman know how to handle guns as naturally as they know how to handle babies." This statement, radical for its time, reflected her vision of society, where women were capable, prepared, and not dependent on men for protection. Annie wasn't a political activist in the traditional sense. She didn't march or give fiery speeches, but her actions spoke volumes. Every woman she trained became a living testament to the idea that women could be skilled, strong, and self-reliant. Her advocacy extended beyond gender empowerment. Annie had grown up in poverty, losing her father at a young age and taking responsibility for support of her family through hunting. She never forgot the struggles of her childhood. As her career brought her financial success, she consistently used her earnings and influence to support orphaned children and underprivileged youth. She frequently donated money, clothing, and resources to orphanages and charities. But more importantly, she invested her time. Annie visited orphanages across the country, offering shooting lessons, entertainment, and sometimes quiet, personal encouragement to children who had little hope. She believed that discipline, skill, and self-belief could change a child's life, just as marksmanship had changed hers. Annie also financed the education of several young women, helping them pursue careers and lives that would have been out of reach otherwise. These acts of generosity were often carried out quietly, without public announcements or grand gestures. Unlike many celebrities of her era who sought publicity for their charity work, Annie preferred to give without expecting recognition. To her, it was simply the right thing to do. Her role as an advocate for women became even more pronounced when she offered to train female sharpshooters for military service. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, Annie wrote a letter to President William McKinley offering to raise and lead a regiment of 50 female sharpshooters to fight for the United States. She volunteered her own services as well, emphasizing that women were capable of defending their country just as men were, although her offer was not accepted. Due to prevailing gender norms and military policies, It revealed the depth of her patriotism and her unwavering belief in women's abilities. This offer wasn't an isolated stunt. It was consistent with her lifelong advocacy. In interviews and public appearances, Annie often encouraged women to embrace marksmanship not as a novelty, but as a serious skill. Her teaching methods were patient, encouraging, and precise. She broke down techniques step by step, ensuring that her students not only hit targets, but understood the discipline behind the art. For many women, these lessons were transformative. They experienced a sense of empowerment that society rarely afforded them. Her charitable influence extended overseas as well. During her European tours, Annie held special demonstrations for women and children, sometimes free of charge. In England, she trained aristocratic women. In Germany and France, she inspired young girls who had never seen a woman perform such feats with a firearm. Her impact transcended national borders, planting seeds of confidence in women across continents. Annie's charitable spirit became a defining aspect of her legacy. Newspapers of the time occasionally mentioned her donations, but many of her contributions came to light only after her death. Friends, beneficiaries, and local communities shared stories of her quiet kindness, paying hospital bills, funding apprenticeships, or simply offering words of encouragement to those who needed them most. Even after a serious train accident in 1901 that temporarily slowed her performing career, Annie continued to dedicate herself to teaching and charity. Her injuries didn't diminish her resolve. She adapted her methods, focused on exhibitions, and kept training women wherever she went. Her advocacy was not a phase, it was a lifelong mission. Through these efforts, Annie Oakley redefined what it meant to be a woman in her era. She wasn't just a little sure shot who wowed audiences with flawless aim. She was a mentor, a benefactor, and a quiet revolutionary. Her combination of skill, generosity, and conviction made her a powerful figure in the movement toward women's empowerment. Even if she never labeled herself a feminist, she opened doors for countless women, inspired generations to come, and demonstrated that true greatness lies not only in personal achievement, but in lifting others along the way. Her actions laid the groundwork for future female athletes, soldiers, and leaders, women who would step into arenas previously reserved for men and claim their rightful place with confidence and grace. And even as her fame continued to spread, Annie Oakley never forgot her roots. She remained humble, approachable, and deeply committed to the causes that mattered most to her, empowering women and supporting children in need. Her advocacy wasn't a side note in her story. It was a central chapter that revealed the heart behind the legend. As the curtain slowly began to close on Annie Oakley's performing years, her influence did not fade. It evolved. Her story had already transcended the shooting range, the stage, and even the pages of newspapers. But the chapters that unfolded in her later life revealed a woman not just defined by extraordinary skill, but by her unyielding character, her fight for truth, and the enduring mark she left on generations to come. In 1901, a devastating train accident temporarily derailed Annie's career. She suffered significant injuries that forced her to slow down her performing schedule. For someone whose life had revolved around precision and movement, this was a daunting period. Many performers might have faded quietly from public life. Annie, however, refused to surrender. Through determination and intense rehabilitation, she regained her strength and continued performing for years to come, proof of the resilience that had defined her since childhood. But perhaps one of the greatest tests of her strength came not from injury or competition, but from a lie printed in ink. In August 1903, a newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst, part of a vast media empire known for sensational stories, published a scandalous claim. According to the article, Annie Oakley had been arrested for stealing to support a cocaine habit. The woman actually arrested was a burlesque performer who had falsely given Oakley's name, hoping to benefit from the notoriety. But the damage was done. In an era when reputations could be destroyed overnight by the printed word, the story spread like wildfire. Other newspapers across the country reprinted the false report, many without verification. For Annie Oakley, who had built her public image on integrity, precision, and grace, this was more than an insult. It was a direct attack on everything she stood for. She had spent decades cultivating respect as a performer, a mentor, and a role model. She could have ignored the reports, hoping the truth would surface. But Annie was not the kind of woman to let lies define her legacy. She launched an extraordinary libel campaign, a legal battle against the newspapers that had spread the false story. Over the next 6 years, she filed 55 lawsuits against various publishers and won 54 of them. This was an unprecedented feat, especially for a woman in the early 20th century taking on powerful media companies. Annie didn't pursue these lawsuits for financial gain. The legal costs outweighed any damages she received. Her true goal was to restore her name, to make it clear that she would not allow falsehoods to overshadow her life's work. This relentless pursuit of justice revealed yet another dimension of Annie's character. She was not just skilled with a rifle. She was fiercely principled. She understood the power of reputation and truth in shaping history, and she was willing to endure years of courtrooms, cross-examinations, and public scrutiny to defend it. In doing so, she set a powerful example for public figures, especially women, about standing up to media defamation at a time when very few dared to. Even after clearing her name, Annie did not retreat from public life. She continued to perform in exhibitions and special events well into her later years, often astounding audiences who expected age to have dulled her aim. It never did. Her accuracy remained legendary, and her presence commanded respect wherever she went. But more importantly, she transitioned from being just a performer to becoming a living legend, a symbol of a bygone era that still carried weight in a rapidly modernizing America. By the 1910s and 1920s, the world around Annie Oakley had changed dramatically. Automobiles were replacing horses. Cities were expanding, and the frontier spirit of the 19th century was fading into memory. But Annie remained a cultural touchstone, a reminder of courage, discipline, and artistry. Her story continued to inspire a new generation, particularly women, who were now fighting for the right to vote, work, and participate more fully in public life. Annie's earlier advocacy and example had planted seeds that were now bearing fruit. She received countless letters from fans and aspiring shooters, many of whom had grown up watching her perform. Some were young women who had taken up shooting because of her example. Others were men who had admired her skills since childhood. She responded to many of these letters personally, often offering advice or encouragement. Unlike many celebrities who distanced themselves from their fans, Annie remained warm, humble, and accessible. Her influence on popular culture was equally profound. She became the subject of songs, stories, and eventually stage productions and films. Even before her passing, her name had become synonymous with precision and female empowerment. The famous 1946 Broadway musical Annie, Get Your Gun, though fictionalized and romanticized, was inspired by her life and helped keep her legacy alive for future generations. Her image, a small woman with a calm expression and a rifle held confidently, became iconic, representing both frontier legend and modern female strength. Annie Oakley also inspired military marksmanship programs and shooting clubs, as her training methods were studied and admired for their effectiveness. Her disciplined, calm approach became a model for many professional marksmen long after her retirement. She bridged the gap between showmanship and technical excellence, ensuring that her contributions weren't confined to entertainment but extended into serious shooting disciplines. In her later years, Annie spent more time away from the bustling circuits of shows, focusing on teaching, charity work, and enjoying quieter days with Frank Butler, her devoted husband and partner throughout her journey. The two shared a bond that lasted for decades, built on mutual respect and unwavering support. Even as the world moved on, they remained symbols of loyalty and partnership behind the curtain of fame. Annie Oakley passed away on November 3rd, 1926, at the age of 66. Frank followed her just 18 days later, a poignant testament to the depth of their connection. But Annie's story did not end with her death. In many ways, that was when her legend truly took root. Her legacy lived on in multiple dimensions. She became a historical icon, studied by scholars for her impact on gender roles, media, and entertainment. She remained a heroine for shooters, inspiring both men and women to strive for excellence. And perhaps most importantly, she stood as a symbol of grace under fire, literally and figuratively. She faced poverty, sexism, injury, and defamation, and met each challenge with quiet strength and unshakable resolve. Today, her name continues to resonate far beyond the shooting range. Museums preserve her rifles and costumes, Her story is taught in history classes as an example of resilience and trailblazing spirit. Female athletes, soldiers, and performers often cite her as a figure who broke barriers long before it was common to do so. Annie Oakley didn't just live in her era, she shaped it. And long after the applause of the Wild West shows faded, her legacy endures, a shining example of skill, resilience, and timeless grace.